Well, at a time when there is a lot of grim news, we're actually going to look in this panel at something that I think is a little bit optimistic. The context, of course, is that while the US has shown many strengths, I think, in recent years, there's one area that I think brings us here where we have a profound weakness, and that is underinvestment in children, and especially human capital of children, leading to outcomes that should, I think, embarrass the country. But I think this poll actually offers us, illuminates a way forward. And so let me start with that. Celinda, can you just offer maybe a 30,000-foot level of what the findings of the poll are?
Sure, and thank you, and it's delightful to be here, and it's very formidable to follow the previous speaker. And I'm delighted to have done this poll with Kristen, and it's our second annual poll and really shows the leadership of Common Sense Media. This is a poll of parents and children, and it's a particularly in-depth poll, but it shows a great deal of pessimism. And if we look at the first slide, you can see here that parents and children are not confident about, they think that things are going only fair or poorly for children, and people are more pessimistic. We see moms in particular pessimistic, and parents of older children particularly pessimistic. So there is a call for change here. People are pessimistic about the economy, about mental health, about education, and about the price of housing for children.
What I find, well, I said this was going to be optimistic, then we started talking about everybody's pessimistic. But
the bad news first.
What I find a little bit of optimism about is that there is shared pessimism among Democrats and Republicans alike.
That's right.
Some glimmer of consensus. And one of the things that I've worried about, Kristen, is that there is some risk that children's issues become democratic issues in ways that make it harder to actually get things done at a national level. And I think the poll actually suggests that there is real consensus here. Is that real? Can you talk about that?
Sure. One of the things that I think, again, is the good news in the bad news is that there are so many issues nowadays where Republicans and Democrats don't even necessarily agree that there is a problem. If I had done a poll a year or two ago and asked people, do you believe that something like climate change is a crisis? You would have seen Democrats saying yes and Republicans saying maybe not so much. And similarly, I could have said, do you think the situation at the border is a crisis? And you would have seen Republicans saying yes and Democrats maybe saying not so much. But in this poll, in data point after data point after data point, we see Republicans and Democrats alike at least agreeing on that fundamental premise that yes, there is a crisis afoot here, that it is a crisis in terms of affordability, cost of living, expectations for economic standing for children once they grow up. It's a crisis around things like mental health, which I'm excited to talk about, but there really is a state of at least alarm and a sense that we need to do something. You will find less agreement perhaps on the specifics of what the something is, but at least we've got to a place where both sides do feel like there is something that needs to be done. I think the economic piece of this is particularly interesting. We know that there is a lot of sense that cost of living is an acute crisis in the moment, but we also find in the data worries about the long-term affordability for kids as they grow up, particularly as Celinda mentioned around things like housing. That's an area where I think you don't see necessarily clear right versus left solutions. This idea that, hey, we need to do something to make sure that people can afford to buy a home one day. In our data, we found 66% say they're not confident that children growing up today will be able to afford a house. But the other main thing that we find is a belief across party lines that education is going to be key to solving a lot of this. We find that in our survey, the ability to afford a college education or some kind of job training after high school is also something parents are worried that kids won't be able to afford. And if you can't get that right, if you can't get the education piece solved, then that means all the opportunity that flows from it, all of the economic opportunity that flows from it is also being lost.
Let me, since you emphasized affordability and housing, Celinda, let me come to you with what I find as a liberal is kind of an awkward question, perhaps. That emphasis on the difficulty of housing affordability comes through over and over. And one of the things that surprised me in the poll was the degree to which respondents believed that President Trump would address children's problems in the country. And that really puzzled me. But then when I saw to the extent to which people perceived housing costs as a children's issue, and I think many people around the country think that Democrats, frankly, have bungled housing affordability, particularly in the West Coast, I wondered if that undermines our credibility on other children's issues. So how should we, I mean, is that the way to look at the credibility that President Trump seems to bring to many people about these issues, even, this was taken before he became president, but right when he was about to, abolish the Department of Education, for example?
Well, I think that, first of all, things may have changed. There may be some erosion here. But I think what's really interesting is that there's probably a unique moment here. And that unique moment is that people see a role for government. And ironically, with Donald Trump in charge of the federal government, Republicans are more open to a role for federal government. Now, nobody, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, thinks the government has done a good job. No one trusts the government. But there is a very, very active role for government, for federal government. We use the dreaded F word, for state and local government. And there are 36 gubernatorial races up, 30 AGs races up in 2026. So there is a consensus now that might not have been possible to the degree that it is if we'd had, ironically, a Democratic governor, a Democratic president, to do something using government as a tool, to have investments. And what's also interesting about this is a survey of parents and children. Last year we did a survey of all voters. Only 28% of the voters have children under 18. But now people have heard Jeff, and they see a real consensus for grandparents are very appealed to by doing something for their children and their grandchildren. And people without children think that this is indeed the future of the country. And mental health and education, which people are really focusing on, is about the future of the country and the state that they're in and the communities that we're in.
If I can jump in really quickly on the Republican piece of this, I mean, I think one, it is the fact that when you ask Republicans if you think the federal government should be doing X, Y, or Z, or do you trust the federal government, that is now Donald Trump. And they quite like Donald Trump, and they quite trust what he would do. And so I think that's causing some of these Republican numbers to look a little more confident in the potential role of a federal government and more interested in seeing federal government involvement than you might have seen under a Democratic administration. But I also, zooming out even beyond just this poll, I mean, we are seeing a moment where a lot of the more limited government orthodoxies have kind of been challenged by Donald Trump. That his era, and you see this with sort of the way that Vice President Vance talks and where he wants to kind of take the party, is a little less focused on limited government as a means, as an end in and of itself, and rather, when do we make government more limited as a means to some other end? And when is there actually a really important role for government in, say, making sure families can have a more affordable life? I think you're seeing some changes in some of that orthodoxy, which is really interesting.
And Kristen, to me, one of the most striking findings had to do with mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, among both the respondents who were kids and among the parents. So can you talk a little bit about what you found there? Sure.
So parents and teens in our survey really were clear that they think that mental health in their community and in addition to sort of worries about their own lives is a really big deal. In our data, we find that they find social media to be a major contributor to this. But we also found, concerns that just kids today may not be as resilient or as able to sort of be independent as they have been in the past. We notably see a really interesting gender divide on some of this. We see that it is moms, much more so than dads, who are really worried about the mental health of kids these days, and it is girls more so than boys. So there is a difference in the way this conversation is being had between moms and dads and girls and boys. But even among the dads and even among the boys, there is still a sense that kids' mental health is a real issue and something needs to be done about it.
One thing that I think that's very interesting about this is the degree to which kids themselves recognize the mental health. It is acute. 67% of kids say that the mental health of kids is a major issue. And we have two generations coming up, Gen Z and the Alpha generation, who are applying mental health to every problem. When we do something about homelessness, they say mental health is a component. When we do something about crime, they say mental health is a component. Education, mental health is a component. And people have a very broad notion of mental health now. They talk about not just mental health for children, but mental health for parents, mental health for the teachers. So this is really changing, and young people are leading the way in terms of saying that social media is part of the problem and that we need to really address with major resources and major government involvement mental health issues. The stigma has dramatically declined in terms of mental health.
So, Celinda, people report their distress about mental health of young people, but are there obvious steps that they agree on taking as policies, for example, vis-a-vis tech companies, vis-a-vis screens, and so on?
Well, it's interesting because there's some differences between young people and older people, so that setting standards, setting rules, that is very, first of all, recognizing that social media is part of the problem is very, very popular with both parents and children. And then having some standards, having some regulations, very, very popular with both. Putting age limits and verifying age, very popular with the parents, much less popular with the kids.
I took away the popularity of policies that would ban Facebook and mandate reading of the New York Times, for example.
There you go.
I'm not sure everybody saw that. Kristen, one area of real agreement had to do with K through 12 education. And I mean, one of the things that has distressed me has been that both parties have fundamentally moved away from real structural efforts. That we've been caught in these culture wars about what books are in the library more than whether kids can actually read. Mm-hmm. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that I think 86% of respondents actually think that K through 12 education is something that we need to focus on. How real is that? Do people actually agree on what needs to be done, or are they just fighting over what books are in the library?
So there's very much an agreement that fixing K through 12 public schools is important as a kind of foundational first step you need for everything else above it to flow from it. Tackling something like higher education is going to be challenging if the kids entering our higher education system are not coming with what they need to succeed. Fixing economic opportunity for high school graduates is going to be hard if high school diplomas don't have real meaning, that it actually stands for children have something that is valuable. I don't want to suggest that that means Republicans and Democrats all agree on what should be done in schools. And for sure, when we ask parents, what do you think are the things that are most important for helping kids to succeed and thrive? I mean, among Republican parents, you do still see some of these cultural things pop up. We need to have God at the center of their lives. They need to be raised in a two-parent household. Those sorts of things still really are important for Republicans. And I don't want to undersell that. But that doesn't also mean that they think, oh, everything is fine structurally with the policies of how this is working. Our schools have enough money, nothing to see here. I mean, we do see in this research a real belief that we should not be cutting funding from schools. I think, frankly, that's part of why you are seeing, even in this whole conversation about eliminating the Department of Education, the Trump administration trying to go to such great lengths to say, but don't worry, the money will still make it to the schools somehow. It'll just be in a different way. They sort of understand that the politics of cutting funding to schools are devastating across the right and the left.
You know, the other thing that's interesting about education is people have a very big appetite for lots of different kinds of education. So it's not just, they're very concerned about the basics, reading and math, but they also think it's very important to have art and music and sports. It's very important to teach people, to help with mental health, to teach people confidence and responsibility, financial literacy. Very important not only to have opportunities for higher ed, but also to have career and technical learning and skill training, bridging high school and community college, or bridging high school and jobs. So what's interesting is that, and this is very bipartisan, people have huge appetites for education and really see this as a fundamental investment in our economy in our future and in our children.
And one final thing to add to that, I mean, in our survey, we asked a question about what are the things that worry you the most about, the kids these days relative to maybe kids a couple of decades ago. And yes, they're worried that kids these days, maybe they can't read or write or do math as well as maybe we used to train kids. But it was also those things about the ability to be independent, the ability to think critically, the ability to be resilient. These are all areas, and it goes beyond just, well, what do our NAEP scores say, or how are kids performing on tests? I mean, that's important, but it is the bigger picture of what it takes to thrive and succeed in the 21st century that people are very concerned kids are not necessarily getting.
Celinda, let me play devil's advocate for a moment and push back. One of the things I really like about this survey is the degree to which it shows a consensus on a way forward, agreement on these fundamental issues that I think the US has truly neglected. But if I put on my skeptical journalist hat, then I would note that every advocacy organization in the history of the world, when it has conducted a poll on issues that it cares about, finds immense bipartisan concern about those issues. And we had kind of a test with the refundable child tax credit. Here was a policy that research had shown would dramatically reduce child poverty, a huge stain on our country. And indeed, it was introduced, and it succeeded in reducing child poverty by half. And ahead of time, we thought from polls that this would be wildly popular and would be sustained, and President Biden thought that. And in fact, it ended with barely a whimper. The party that killed it did not pay a political price that was obvious to me. So how real is this support we're seeing in the polls if we can't even preserve one of the most fundamental pillars of supporting children around the country?
It's a really powerful and important question. And I would say every public poll you shows bipartisan support. We deliver a lot of polls that don't show that in the back room. But the issue is, I remember when we worked for the Children's Hospital, and they had a slogan that came out of the research, who's for kids and who's just kidding. Our problem is not opposition. Our problem is cynicism. And this data that Kristen just put up shows you there's not a whimper because people's expectations are so low. People don't expect anything to make a difference. People don't trust government. And that's a bipartisan consensus. And actually, the independents are the least trusting of anyone. So what we have to prove to people is more, and this is where I think common sense is so important, and where speeches like Jeff's are so important in his model. We don't have to prove that this is the right thing to do. We have to prove that we can get this done. And when it fails, people go, yeah, that's what I expected. And, the way they processed it is, two people played shenanigans in the back room, and then parties want to gain power more than they want to help the country. Both parties want to gain power more than they want to help the country. And nobody listens to us about these issues. So it is important that we have to take a stand. We have to show that this can be done. I think one of our goals ought to be to make sure that every governor who is running has this in their agenda in 2026. And I think most people will hold those governors accountable because they feel at state and local level, we can make things happen more than we can at the federal government, even though they want federal government investment.
When you think about government programs or approaches to things like taxes that are going to sunset, we are going to see a battle play out in Washington over the next couple of months about what do you do about renewing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? What do you do about the Trump tax cuts from the first time that are now coming to an end? And there are going to be a lot of fights about who gets what when that is being hashed out. And I think data like this really underscores that it is important that as we hash out who gets tax cuts and who gets tax hikes, that American families who put this new administration into office because they were saying everything costs too much, that is every exit poll finding I can point to suggests that was a huge piece of why we have the government we have in Washington, that if that gets forgotten, I do believe there will be a political price to be paid by the time we get to the midterms. And so whether it is, the data that we find in our survey around a fairly bipartisan consensus that something is broken when it comes to childcare, and so are there levers you can pull in the tax code to make that better, that something is wrong when it comes to paid leave when people welcome new children into their family, is there a lever you can pull there? I mean, there's going to be so much tension around this tax bill, and there are going to be a lot of winners, but a lot of losers. But I do think if anything's going to happen in the next couple of months, it's going to be in the nuts and bolts of how Republicans put together a bill on that front that tells us what their priorities really are.
That's the challenge for all of us going forward. So there's a lot more in the poll, and as Jim suggested, there is a longer piece in the New York Times today by Claire Kane Miller about it. I encourage you to check it out. And please join me in thanking Celinda and Kristen for doing this poll and walking us through it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.